Greetings. Hello. Welcome to today's global webinar, What You Need to Know About the Proposed Changes to the Standards. My name is Mike Peppers. I'm from Austin, Texas. I'm the chairman of the International Internal Audit Standards Board. I think you're probably just seeing my icon today. I'm having some video challenges with the technology, but I believe the audio will work fine. And in my role as moderator, our two presenters will be the ones engaging with you the most, so I think we will still be fine. But when I am not working with the IIA and my colleagues in the Standards Board on this project, I am the Chief Audit Executive at the University of Texas System. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Also, today, we have two very experienced and esteemed presenters that will be talking with you. First, Paul Sobel has been engaged as a senior advisor for us on the professional standards and working with the Standards Board and the staff as he is presenting here, as also has Urton Anderson, who will be one of the presenters at our second webcast that we have later today. Also today with us is Larissa Nelson, who is on staff at IIA headquarters. She's a senior manager for professional standards, and she has been the lead technical editor for our Global Internal Audit Standards project, but also, as you see, a certified individual herself, and so brings a great perspective on this. We also have another staff support, David Petrinsky, who will be presenting in the evening session with Urton, and I get the pleasure to work with all four of them. So thank you very much. So here's what we're going to cover today. I'm not going to read every line on this, but you can see that we are going to talk through a bit about the project itself. We are going to talk about what has changed, how the structure looks different, and then we'll get into some more details on the topic and also our due process as it relates to this public comment period. So this IPPF Evolution project, one of few of the things that I wanted to point out to you today is that really our International Internal Audit Standards Board has representation from so many different parts of the world and different types of industries and that type of thing. So as we get into this, I do want to mention a few things that we'll be talking about from a perspective of some of the administrative things. We certainly want to make certain that you receive the NASBA CPE credit. And so to do that, you need to maintain this connection that you're on here for now. And there will not be polling questions, but there will be alertness checks. And so something will pop up on your screen and basically say, are you still there? Make certain that you click on those. And please ensure you haven't maximized any one widget or have disabled any pop-up blockers. The CPE certificates will be emailed within approximately 60 business days. If you do have any technical issues at any point, press the F5 key or the Command R keys if you're on the Mac to refresh your console. That usually solves most of the challenges. But it's also recommended that you close out any other programs to make sure that you have the bandwidth and related to that. We do want to entertain questions, but I can tell you we have so much content that we will not be going through a lot of questions today, but we will take your questions. We'll cover, if we see some trends and themes or a lot of common questions, we will have a few minutes for that at the end, but we also will gather all of the questions and put together a Q&A document and go over that, and we will email that to everyone later. So those are a few of the administrative things I wanted to mention. So the standards, as now we're here on the IPPF Evolution project, a couple of reminders. The standards are out for public comment right now. they're not final standards. And they are certainly not only subject to change, but I'm certain they will change because, the Standards Board, although it has tried to, as you'll see, take a great amount of input, that we need to hear from all of you, and we're going to be mentioning it several times through the presentation, and even when we get to the end, that there is a way that we have put together. It's called a survey, although that's just kind of the technical term for the technology, that we want you to go into that survey and give us your feedback, and so we'll certainly do that. So, of course, you can see that we've the folks that I did mention from the Standards Board that are in place. We have 21 of us from Australia, Brazil, Canada, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Taiwan, Japan, everywhere. And so these members are very, very dedicated internal audit leaders who are active with their affiliates and their respective countries and regions, and I have greatly enjoyed working with them for the last several years. And I made reference earlier, a moment ago, to the staff at the IIA that has just been so engaged. The leadership team, Dr. Lily B., who has been extremely helpful and through this, working with not only the Standards Board, but also our liaison with our IPPF Oversight Council. And so that has just been a tremendous help for us. Also, Anthony Pugliese, our President CEO, and the Global Board have been extremely supportive, and we greatly appreciate that. A recent addition to the team is Kat Hughes, who is the new Vice President of Standards and Guidance, who joined the IA earlier this year and has jumped right in. Also, I've also previously referenced David Petrisky, and who's joined the Standards Project in March of this year, and then also mentioned Larissa as well. So that's a bit of an overview there. So I would like to just give you a little bit of a view where this project is and has been. It's going. And it really has been the last 3 years because when I came on as chairman, the Standards Board was chomping at the bit to revisit the IPPF that has not had a significant very significant review and overhaul in almost 20 years. And so that actually is a great thing because it shows that it stood the test of time with just a few updates. But as you know, if you've already looked at this, we've now had quite a significant restructuring in the proposed version that you have. We did a fair, just in terms of the research that started back then, so many different things that we did, reaching out not only with surveys but focus groups and feedback from our affiliates globally, our stakeholders, our principal partners, and we just had numerous ways in which we gathered information. And also we looked and revisited our due process because we do have, as I referenced earlier a moment ago, there's a group called the IPPF Oversight Council, which is an independent group made up of other organizations that are related and understand our field, but not in internal auditing. And based on that, they look at us and ensure that we are setting the standards in public interest in accordance with the process we set. So we did that. Obviously, we've restructured, and it's been a great deal of time with the content. And now we are a little bit more than halfway through our 90-day public comment period. And I do want to mention here that it went out on March 1st. And so the English version has 90 days that will close on May 30th. But there were 23 additional languages that the draft was translated into, and some of those opened a little bit later, and so they will have a little bit more time. But June 26th is going to be the latest for all languages, so that the Standards Board can have this information and assess it and have serious discussions at our July meetings that we will be having to move toward the final version. The survey results and other responses are being analyzed by the IASB and Standards Board and headquarters to review and revise that draft. They will decide on the disposition and the resolution of the public comments, and then we will publish the global internal audit standards. And our target is by the end of the calendar year, 2023. And then they will become effective 12 months after that. And of course, other materials that will follow along, like the CIA exam or the textbooks or training and all that, may not change immediately on that effective date, but we will certainly be sharing information and updates about that as we go along the way. So at that point, that is many of the administrative things and about the project. I again want to thank everybody who's been involved, and now it's your turn, our members and stakeholders around the world. And so to do that and to help you be as informed as possible, we are going to share with you today some information that will hopefully help you navigate and understand some of the things perhaps better, and as I said, give you an opportunity to ask questions. So with that, we're going to talk about the section of the changes to the IPPF, and I'm going to turn that over to Larissa at this point. So welcome, Larissa.
Hi, thank you, Mike, and thank you everyone for being here. We're really excited to show you our proposed changes. I'm sure you recognize this on the left, our current IPPF, and some of the changes we've proposed here are taking the several elements of this mandatory guidance on the left IPPF and moving it into the global internal audit standards. So I'm sure you've probably heard we have a new name, Global Internal Audit Standards. Simple and easy to say, and that was the change to from the old to the new. But we've got the 5 mandatory elements: the mission, definition, core principles, code of ethics, and standards from the existing IPPF will all become part of the standards. And also we've proposed bringing implementation guidance into the standards so that these will no longer exist as separate entities, but they'll all be part of the standards. All in one place, also easy to communicate to stakeholders what we do and able to find it easily. And then we have our guidance, our existing practice guides that are very helpful to many people, and our G tags. Those will continue to exist, but instead of supplemental guidance, recommended guidance, we're just going to call them guidance. And so that, again, is a little bit of a simplification. And we are thinking and proposing, the Standards Board has been looking at some way to bring in topical issues and things that are emerging, things that are specific risk areas. And we've looked and been talking about topical requirements as a possible addition to this framework. So these are not developed yet, but they are being considered, and they would set requirements for covering governance, risk management, and control processes when auditing specific subjects. They would be a new mandatory element, and there are 2 questions on the survey about topical requirements, but they are not developed yet, so we're still considering them, and we'd really like your input and feedback on the idea. Next, I want to just move to showing you a little bit about the new structure of the Global Internal Audit Standards themselves. This is our main focus of today's presentation. So this is our new structure, looking at organizing these standards into 5 domains with 15 principles. The principles are broad descriptions of a basic assumption or a rule summarizing a group of requirements and the considerations that follow. So for this new structure, each principle is accompanied by standards that relate to that principle. We have 53 standards, and in the standards, you'll find in each standard requirements. These are the must statements. You'll find considerations for implementation, and those use should or may to indicate common and preferred practices for implementing those requirements. Also, some of the interpretations from the existing standards, would go and end up in this considerations for implementation section, because they're really just interpreting the requirement and helping internal auditors to apply those principles to the requirements. Then we have the considerations for evidence of conformance, which also has come from implementation guidance, but these are examples of recommended ways to demonstrate that the requirements of the standard have been implemented. So these aren't necessarily required, but they're recommended ways to demonstrate that you have met the requirements. So we also just want to mention in the considerations for implementation that there are some specific new additions. We were asked to look at making sure that we address public sector, small internal audit functions, and outsourced internal audit services when there was something special or a certain applicability that needed to be paid attention to. So we have added those in the considerations for implementation section. These callouts should help clarify expectations unique to those individual conditions or situations. The examples in the evidence of conformance and in the considerations for implementation are not meant to be requirements. They're not meant to be exhaustive, but they're meant to help implement the requirements. And now I'm going to move on to looking at the overall complete structure of the domains and principles, and you'll see them listed here. So these are the 15 principles. We start out with domain 1, and that is the purpose of internal auditing. Domain 2, ethics and professionalism. You'll see here that the Code of Ethics is well represented. We haven't lost anything from the Code of Ethics. We did look, the Standards Board looked carefully at every one of the principles and rules of conduct and brought over the important elements and then looked at where there might be gaps. We brought due professional care in from the attribute standards, the existing attribute standards, and we really looked into what those different standards mean and added that as a principle with several standards underneath it, which we'll talk about when we get into that domain. And then for domain 3, we've got governing the internal audit function. A lot of these were existing standards and principles. The principles are of that, you know, that positioning the internal audit function for independence, having it authorized by the board, its authority is granted by the board, and that the internal audit function is overseen by the board. By bringing these all into the third domain, we brought the focus on that relationship between the CAE, the internal audit function, and the board. And then in domain 4, that's managing the internal audit function. There you see basically everything from the standard 2000 to 2070, the CAE level requirements, but bringing those all together here into these 4 main principles: plans strategically, manages resources, communicates effectively, and enhances quality. And finally, in the 5th domain is where, as some people say, the sausage gets made. The performing internal audit services, the day-to-day activities of planning engagements effectively, conducting engagement work, and communicating engagement conclusions and monitoring action plans or follow-up. So with that, I just wanted to give you an overview, and we will move along to the glossary. Just to give you a little look quickly at some changes to terminology. So some noteworthy changes. It's worth reviewing the glossary before getting started on reading the draft, just to make sure that you understand terms that may have changed, such as consulting services now are called advisory services. We did surveys to help find out which terms caused problems and which terms would be considered for changing. Engagement opinion, we're now calling engagement conclusion. Internal audit activity is changed to internal audit function. Purpose, authority, and responsibility, those are concepts in Standard 1000 that we're summing up in the word mandate, internal audit mandate. And then policies and procedures, we kind of looked at the scope of that, and we thought the term methodologies better captured all of the aspects of setting up the internal audit functions, policies, and procedures. So those are some of the term changes. And then you'll also see that there are existing terms that have new definitions. A board is one of those, control processes, fraud. Internal auditing, the definition that was our leading statement, is still in the glossary. It had a few minor changes, so we want you to take a look at that. Risk appetite should was in our glossary before, but now we're using it in a little different way. So all of those things are covered. And also, if you'll notice, there are quite a few new terms. So it's definitely worth reviewing. We hope you'll do that. These new terms are just meant to help assist in the interpretation of the standards and how we use these terms in the standards. So with that, let me move to the next slide. And I believe we are moving into the purpose of internal audit, domain 1. And I'm going to turn that over to Paul to talk about domain 1.
Well, thank you, Larissa. Domain 1 is an interesting one because in some respects it's the simplest, and in other respects that makes it one of the most complex of all the domains. So in essence, domain 1 was to try and provide an overall statement about really what internal audit is, what it should be. Some have referred to that first statement there as kind of an elevator pitch. If you're in an elevator, you've only got 1 or 2 floors to explain, well, what is internal auditing? That would be what you could say. Now, of course, that is very, very high level. And so included in the purpose are these bullet points that you see in 2 boxes. First of all, you have really the benefits of internal auditing, which are listed in the left box. And then you have the considerations to really make internal auditing most effective. How can you optimize internal auditing? And that's really what you see in the right box. So a couple of key points about this, and I've already seen a question on this in the Q&A. The purpose statement is intended to incorporate the key elements of the prior definition of internal auditing, as well as the mission of internal audit. We believe we've done that, not in just the statement above. Obviously, you have to go into the individual bullet points to get there. The other, I think, structural change is one Larissa just referred to, and that is that since we won't have a formal definition of internal auditing as a separate element in the IPPF, now it just becomes part of the glossary. So the definition of internal auditing with some tweaks is still in the glossary. Now let's talk a little bit about the definition and the mission and how those were incorporated. As a reminder, the current definition says internal auditing is an independent, objective assurance and consulting activity designed to add value and improve an organization's operations. It helps an organization accomplish this by the objectives by bringing a systematic, disciplined approach to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance processes. Now, there's quite a bit in that. So where does it come in here? Well, let's start with the word independence. The first thing that you may have noticed is that independence was not in the opening statement, because we believe independence is really the means to the end. It's really something that is a condition that will allow the internal audit function to be effective, to help the organization be successful, and to deliver the benefits. So as a result, you will notice that independence is one of those bullet points on the right side, because it is still a very, very critical part of what internal auditing is about and what it will do in the future. Another term that you see missing is consulting. Before it said assurance and consulting services. We've changed that to advisory. And there are a variety of reasons for that. We think advisory is just a little more of a current term that probably better reflects how people use it. So instead of consulting, we use advice, consulting services, we use advisory services. Now, also in the definition, it talked about add value and improve an organization's operations. Well, we've replaced that in a few respects. First of all, in the opening statement at the top, we say enhances the organization's success. That's really about being successful, achieving objectives, having successful operations, etc. But you'll also notice when you get into the benefits on the left side, talks about strengthening value creation, protection, and sustainability. So that's another way that we believe it's really a benefit of internal auditing and helping to enhance the organization's success. Now, the very end of the definition talked about risk management, control, and governance, and you see that in the second bullet on the left side, that internal audit strengthens. We switched the words around because we thought it was important to start with governance, which is the highest level. But governance, risk management, and control is clearly there as well. And we think the decision-making and oversight kind of goes along with all of this. I mean, successful businesses make better decisions more of the time. Now let's touch on the mission. And this has created a lot of dialogue on social media and some of the early responses. The current mission is to enhance and protect organizational value by providing risk-based and objective assurance, advice, and insight. Now, of course, the enhance and protect organizational value, I've already pointed out, is in that first bullet on the left side about value creation, protection, and sustainability. So that's still there. But what's missing? Well, the word risk-based has been taken out. And this has caused a lot of consternation, and it's certainly something the Standards Board will have to reconsider. But the thinking was that risk-based was really a narrower term than what we were trying to get to at the very top statement here. In fact, some in the Standards Board said, well, why don't we say it's objectives-based instead of risk-based? But objectives is really embedded in organization success. So we felt that term didn't need to be in the purpose of internal auditing. Now, having said that, it is still very much in the standards. I mean, you can go all the way to Standard 9.5 about the internal audit plan, where we talk about how important it is to use risk as a basis for determining what goes into the internal audit plan. And you can move into Standard 13 about engagement risk assessment, where, again, we're talking about the importance of using risk as a foundation for what you're going to audit within a project. So again, the whole idea of risk-based is not lost. It's still embedded throughout the standards, but it wasn't included here. And again, if you still feel strongly about that, certainly feel free to put that in your comments. The word insight was also left out. This was one that, boy, we had a lot of debates on, and checking a thesaurus and trying to find out what are the right words. And in the end, what we decided is that insight is really just a form of advice, that it was an important form of advice, but it was a form of advice. So we included that in the definition of advice. Now, we still do have references to such things as identifying key themes and conclusions in certain areas that I think get to the concept of insight. So we still feel insight is embedded in the standards. We just didn't feel that it necessarily had to be specified in the purpose statement. Now, a couple of other things to talk about. Public interest, that's the phrase we hear a lot about. And you'll notice the bottom bullet point on the left says ability to serve the public interest. So we are helping to strengthen the organization's ability to serve the public interest. This is very important. Every organization needs to serve the public interest, and that is part of what internal audit can do, is help our organizations do that better. Now, there's a second aspect of public interest as well, and that is that the way the standards are being updated, the due diligence process, the oversight by the IPPF Oversight Council, the engagement of stakeholder input, et cetera, that is setting standards in the public interest. It's a slightly different concept, but one that's very important, one that the IPPF Oversight Council has taken quite seriously. So we feel strongly that public interest is still very much embedded in this as well. So with that in mind, let's move on to the first of the domains that include principles and standards, and that's ethics and professionalism. As Larissa mentioned, this really combined what was previously in the Code of Ethics with the principles and rules of conduct there, and then also in some of the standards. So we decided that it was best to have this as kind of a first domain underneath the purpose. This domain primarily applies to individuals. So that was part of why the due professional care was brought in here, because that's an individual type requirement as opposed to something for the function as a whole. And so what you see as you read across here, these principles are really for the 5 principles from the old Code of Ethics, as well as the exercise due professional care. Now, I'm going to go through these in a little more detail because I think it's important to understand them, particularly since they will relate to presumably everybody on this call. So first of all, we have demonstrating integrity. This is very similar to what we had before, the integrity principle in the Code of Ethics. And a couple of things have been added here. First of all, we instead of just talking about honesty, we also talk about honesty and courage. This is something that I think has become a topic, certainly at the CAE level, but I think it really applies to all internal auditors. And that's why we thought courage is an element that should be included in this particular standard. Now, we also have some public sector considerations, recognizing that things don't work the same in the public sector as the private sector. And you'll see several references in these domains to public sector. And this is one particular area where we talked about the importance that in the public sector, they are there to protect the public interest. Every organization serves the public interest, but in the public sector, it's actually protecting the public interest. Standards 1.2 and 1.3 are really pretty similar to what there was before. In 1.2, we're talking about it's not just your personal or your functions ethical expectations. You also have to understand the ethical expectations of your organization. And sometimes you may have audit findings that relate to whether people are in fact living within the ethical expectations of the organization. So that gets spelled out there. And of course, legal and professional behavior is just as it sounds. We all need to be complying with laws and regulations. Second, we get to maintain objectivity. And again, objectivity was part of the old code of ethics. Now, one thing that's important here, since objectivity is very personal oriented, relates to the individual, where independence relates more to the internal audit function as a whole, we've separated the discussions of objectivity and independence. Those were very much intermingled, particularly in the standards before, but we've separated those now. So you'll see objectivity covered here in the ethics and professionalism domain because it relates to individuals. And then you will see independence covered a little bit later when we get into the governing internal auditing, because that relates to the positioning of the internal audit function. So that's probably one of the key changes here. Once again, there's some considerations for implementation of the public sector around safeguarding objectivity. Things operate a little bit differently there. And then disclosure requirements when the CAE takes on roles perhaps beyond internal auditing, the old standard 1112. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get into the independence area as well. Demonstrate competency. So competence is, again, something that is kind of common sense, well spelled out in the Code of Ethics before. Some references in the standards and guidance before as well. One of the things that we added in 3.1 is specific types of knowledge that should be identified. There's basically 7 categories that we think are important. It aligns pretty well with the competency framework and doesn't mean every individual has to have the same exact competencies. Obviously, that's not desirable, but it does give you an idea of the kind of the core competencies that you would want either within individuals or perhaps more broadly within the function as a whole. That's where the chief audit executive needs to make sure that those competencies exist within the function as a whole. Now, one of the big changes is in 3.2, where we actually now spell out the requirement for 20 hours of CPE for all internal auditors. Now, that's less than what it is for a certified internal auditor. You still need 40 hours for that. That doesn't change. But the point here is that in a rapidly changing world, we don't believe that somebody can go a year without any professional education. So this is a new requirement. We're anxious to get feedback from the profession and see what people really think about it. But we believe that this will help establish kind of a floor of competency and capabilities within the profession, which will help the profession be even more respected in the future. Next, we have exercising due professional care. Now, this is the one that was not specifically in the Code of Ethics before, although there were some elements in the Code of Ethics before. And this was brought out of the standards. Larissa referred to the attribute standards around due professional care. And what was in the standards before was the requirement to conform with the internal audit standards. We're now calling them the global internal audit standards. And then the due professional care, of course, that's fundamental. That's what everybody should be doing in really every activity within internal audit. Now, 4.3 on professional skepticism, this is a new standard. It doesn't mean it's a new concept. Professional skepticism was certainly something that was discussed throughout much of the internal audit and guidance, but we thought it was so important, went really effectively with due professional care, and again, is really a personal attribute, that we thought it was worth putting a special standard in here relating to professional skepticism. Now, finally, we get into the maintain confidentiality principle. And again, confidentiality was a part of the Code of Ethics before, but I think we've really expanded it in a few different ways here. First of all, in the uses of information, information has grown so dramatically since the last standards were there that we talk more about how you handle information that may be confidential, proprietary, personally identifiable information. So we go into a little bit more detail about all of that as well. Talk a little bit about information that may be in policies and procedures and what the responsibilities are for records retention, et cetera, within internal audit. Again, none of this are new ideas, but some of these are new requirements relative to what had previously been in, say, just the Code of Ethics. And then there's also some considerations related to the public sector. So kind of in a nutshell, let me reiterate that the ethics and professionalism domain is now effectively our Code of Ethics. We're not calling it that as such, but that is the Code of Ethics. It's been expanded to include the professionalism part of it. I think there's much more information about the expectations and requirements than was in the prior Code of Ethics, but it's still something that every internal auditor will be expected to comply with. So with that in mind, now we'll move on to the governing domain, governing the internal audit function. This one has been fun, to say the least. And why I say that is because we have we've taken a little different approach than was taken with the previous standards. And a couple of things that I'll say at the top level here is, first of all, these principles and standards have requirements for the board. And so not surprisingly, we've gotten many questions. In fact, I've even seen some already in the Q&A about, hey, these are internal audit standards. You can't require the board to do anything. Well, what we're really trying to do here is increase the partnership between the board and the chief audit executive, increase the amount of dialogue that occurs. And so what you're going to see only in this domain are requirements for the board and requirements for the CAE and some joint requirements, with the idea that the board needs to do certain things for internal audit to be successful, but they can't do it on their own. So the chief audit executive is going to have to enable, support, provide information, whatever, to allow and help the board to be able to do that. Now, that still doesn't answer the question of why should a board even care? Well, what you don't want to do is walk into your board and just say, here are the new requirements for you. Let me know if you have any questions, because there's no way that's going to work. They'll say exactly what I said at the beginning. These are internal audit standards, not board standards. However, if you walk into the board, and by the way, let me take a moment here to talk about when we say board, what we really mean. Larissa referred to this. It's been expanded, the definition in the glossary, and there's that definition as well as some additional discussion in the kind of the preamble to this domain. So I definitely encourage you to read that. And what we were focusing on is making sure that, okay, for most people, board is going to be a committee of the board, such as audit committee. So when I say board, you think audit committee. In the public sector, it might be different. It could be a board of regents or board of trustees. In the private sector, or not just private sector, but privately held, closely held organizations, there may be really a much simpler governance type structure. And in some other parts of the world, there are two-tier boards. So we explain in the definition how all of this is covered. So once again, when I say board, I'm referring to whatever makes sense for you relative to those definitions. So at the start, once these are approved, what I would do is I would go into the audit committee and say, I don't hand them this first. I would say, let's talk about that mandate. Why are we really here? What do you want from us? What is our purpose? You may show them the purpose statement at that point and talk about, yeah, these are all the things internal audit can do. Is that really what you want? Is that how we can support you in your governance role? Assuming that is a positive conversation, then it turns to, okay, we need your help with that. And in order to get that help, here's some things that we're going to need from you. Here are the things we're going to do to help make sure you can do that. And together, as a partnership, we can help this internal audit function be successful, to achieve its purpose, and ultimately help the organization be successful before. That's the only way this is going to work. But we do believe it can work. And in fact, we had a breakout session at GAM with, I'm guessing, about 150 people in the room. And when I asked questions about, do you think your board will be supportive of Principle 6, Principle 7, 80 to 90% were saying yes. So I know there's some consternation out there, but I think when you really think through it about how to advocate with your board and hold a discussion, I think this can really work. So with that in mind, let's go through the details a little bit. First one talks about the function being authorized by the board. And we introduced a term here called mandate. It's defined as the authority, role, and responsibilities of the internal audit function. I mean, that's something that was probably included in most charters before, but often charters were developed by the CAE and pushed up to the board, and then they just say, okay, that's fine, we approve it. Again, as I said before, the key here is the discussion with the board or audit committee on really what is our mandate? Why are we here? What can we do to help the organization be successful, to help the board be more successful? That needs to be agreed upon right up front, and then it will be included in the charter. There's also other ways that the board can demonstrate its support. We've got a variety of those that are listed in the standard, but things like improving the internal audit charter, approving the internal audit plan, the budget, the resource plan, etc. Now, one other thing about the charter, because people are saying, aren't mandate and charter really synonymous? No, they're not for us. The mandate should be included in the charter, but the charter has many other aspects, some of it somewhat administrative. We don't go through that in this standard because this is about governing the internal audit function. That gets covered when you get to the managing the internal audit function domain, where there's a specific principle or standard that talks about the internal audit charter and all the other things that need to go into it. And as mentioned on the slide, there are some considerations for the public sector. A lot of this governing domain gets really tricky in the public sector. Now, next we'll look at positioned independently. This one shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. As I mentioned before, independence has been a hallmark of our profession for decades. Not a lot has really changed here. 7.1 just talks about the things that were really required before, and now again they're still required in the new one. 7.2 talks about not just the CAE's role, but also qualifications. We introduced some qualifications here, similar to the competencies that were discussed up in Domain 2, of key qualifications the board should consider. Now, why is that important? Because one of the requirements that we have at least put in the draft is that the board should be responsible or be involved with the recruiting, the removal of the CAE, the performance evaluation, remuneration, things like that. If they're going to do that, they have to be in a position to understand the qualifications and say, we think this is what's important. Now, this standard also gets into, okay, what happens when the CAE has a different role in addition to internal audit? We sometimes see that with risk management, compliance. I've seen physical security, and that was covered pretty well in standard 11.12 before. But now we've moved a lot of the important information from the implementation guide up into the considerations for implementation, so it'll be much easier to understand what to do. Then, of course, all of that gets into the safeguards independence. What are the possible safeguards, the board's role, CAE's role, what should be included in the charter, etc. And then finally, overseeing the internal audit function. So if you think about it, principles 6 and 7 are probably really a little bit more focused on one-time events or once-a-year discussions. Principle 8 is much more about the interaction, the ongoing interaction, and the ongoing oversight that needs to occur. So 8.1 just talks about the communications that need to occur. 8.2 gets into the importance of ensuring that internal audit has sufficient resources to achieve its mandate in the internal audit plan. Those discussions typically occurred in the past anyway, but now it's a requirement of the board. And then 8.3 and 8.4 get into the quality assurance and improvement program. That's outlined in much more detail when you get into, again, the managing domain, because the CAE has to develop what those, quality and performance objectives are. But here it just talks about the board's role for overseeing the quality assurance program. And by the way, when we talk about quality now, we're talking conformance plus performance. So these performance objectives take the internal audit function beyond where they are today with just conformance. And then 8.4 talks about the board's role in overseeing the external quality assessment. We did leave the 5-year requirement in there. Some had thought maybe we should go to 3 years. We felt that might be a little bit onerous for many organizations, although one of the considerations for implementation is to consider a more frequent EQA if the risk profile of the internal audit function justifies it. We also left in the self-assessment with independent validation, but said, well, that should really only be done once every 10 years. You shouldn't be able to do that all the time. That's something we'll be very interested to see what kind of feedback we get, particularly from smaller departments. And then, of course, included some of the qualifications of the assessment team as well. So that's a lot. Again, it's a very different domain because it's organized between board requirements, CAE requirements, and joint requirements. But one thing I want to leave you with here is that I really believe most of this, for a well-performing internal audit function that already conformed with the standards, the board was already doing most of this anyway. So you're not asking them to do anything new. You're just helping them understand why they're doing what they're doing. In some cases, there may be some documentation of that needed, maybe a tweak to the audit committee charter, certainly some tweaks to the internal audit charter. But to a great extent, nothing is really changing. We're just positioning it so that the board understands their very important role in helping to enable the internal audit function. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Larissa, and she's going to take us through the managing and performing domains.
Hi there. Thank you, Paul. So yes, talking about the managing the internal audit function, as I mentioned earlier, was kind of a standard 2000 through 2070, not a lot of detail there. And the domain now has more detail and more focus on some aspects that we wanted to highlight. I'm sorry, I pulled up the wrong slide. 1 second. Let me go back to managing. There we go. Okay, so we really heard from the standards board that they wanted to see a focus on the strategic planning. So we've always had the internal audit plan, the plan of engagements that are based on the risk assessment and so forth, but what comes before that and setting up the internal audit function for success in the organization. So first of all, in this domain, you'll notice that all the principles and standards address the chief audit executive in the main principle. And we do explain that this is the top person in charge of internal auditing, but that could be different names. It doesn't have to be chief audit executive. So it doesn't mean if you don't have that title, chief audit executive, that then you don't have, to follow this domain. Whoever is in charge of the function, whoever is the top person responsible for internal auditing. But these standards provide more details about planning strategically, designing methodologies for the function, communicating with stakeholders. There's a big focus on communication, and then measuring performance. So those are some of the things as you look through each of these main principles that are the focus. And we'll go into each one of them a little bit further in more detail here. So in the first plan strategically principle, we have the chief audit executive plans strategically to ensure the internal audit function fulfills its mandate and is positioned for long-term success. And we look at the concepts from standards 2100 to 2130, the governance, risk management, and control processes. Everything starts with understanding those. That's very important to just the basis of the overall function. How to apply those concepts of assessing those areas and contributing to the CAE's understanding as they begin their planning. The CAE is required to understand key governance processes and high-level objectives and risks of the organization, such as those covering financial and non-financial reporting, operational effectiveness and efficiency, asset protection, and legal compliance. Standard 9.2 then, based on that understanding, the CAE develops, we're looking at a vision for the internal audit function with strategic objectives and supporting initiatives to guide the function. So this could be a longer term plan, not just the plan of engagements to be done, but also where do you see the function going? How can you best serve the organization? And then standard 9.3, the internal audit charter, again, as Paul already described this in pretty good detail, but we wanted to focus some on the concepts of what the board assigns or grants to the internal audit function versus the other things that the chief audit executive would document, including the types of services that will be delivered and so forth. So this is a CAE action, but we wanted to emphasize that the mandate is the board action. It's the board relationship. The charter is documenting that, but there's a two-part responsibility. There are also other, administrative and departmental things that are recorded in the charter, and then methodologies we used in standard 9.4, that term to capture the policies, procedures, and processes, your internal audit manual, that kind of concept. But there's definitely more detail about thinking about this up front and ahead of planning for your function and having certain things in place about how things should be done, how processes should be approached. And then standard 9.5, the internal audit plan, both 2010 and 2010.A1 are incorporated. And I wanted to point that out because as some people are very alarmed by seeing risk-based, missing, well, it elevates the risk assessment. Before it was an assurance standard only, it was 2010.A1, but this is required for determining all the priorities of the internal audit plan, not just assurance activities, but in the planning, the risk assessment is definitely emphasized as part of the standard for internal audit plan. And 9.6, coordination and reliance, that we recognize from standard 2050, again, that the chief audit executive must coordinate with the various assurance providers in the organization and evaluate whether they can rely on those, as well as what kind of coverage of risk is going to be optimal for the organization. So that basically covers the planning portion of the domain. And then we look at principle 10, resource management, which really was about one line or maybe two in the existing standards. The standards board really looked at what kind of resources are important and need to be planned for. And they're not just financial and they're not just human, but financial, human, and technological. What does that mean? And also that these things should be discussed with the board. So the standard 10.1 talks about the budget should be presented to the board for approval. But there are special considerations for public sector, small functions, and outsourced functions where it can be a little more complicated and not necessarily under the control of the board. So those are discussed in detail in the considerations. And 10.2, human resource management provides requirements for obtaining and developing internal auditors with the necessary competencies, so that the CAE must establish a program to be involved in the recruitment, the development, and making sure that they retain qualified internal auditors, that they evaluate the competencies, and then discussing with the board the resource plan and having the board approve the resource plan as well. Then in 10.3, we talk about ensuring that the internal audit function has the appropriate technology and that it seeks opportunities to improve by evaluating the technology it's using on a regular basis. So that is another chief audit executive responsibility. And here we did point out that we have some special considerations for small internal audit functions, public sector functions. So the resources can definitely be different. We recognize that, and we hope that those special callouts will help. If we would like to hear your feedback on that when you look at that, to see how that could impact your internal audit function. And now we'll move into Principle 11, communicates effectively. There was really a lot of focus on communication in these standards. I think you'll see that much more. And just starting out this principle, ensuring that the internal audit function communicates effectively with its stakeholders. So there's an emphasis also on stakeholders. We added that word to the glossary. It wasn't in the glossary before. And there's a focus on building relationships and trust in this first standard 11.1 through both formal and informal communications. It means actively, proactively addressing relationship building and communication. We do have the public sector consideration there of that the public is a direct stakeholder for the public sector, and that also elected officials may be stakeholders, and that may require some specific approaches that maybe take a little more care. So that's pointed out. 11.2, your effective communication is very similar to what we had in the Quality of Communication Standard 2420. Accurate, objective, clear, concise, constructive, complete, and timely communications, both at the level of the CAE and for engagement communication. So throughout, that's emphasized in both this domain and the performing domain. Standard 11.3, communicating results, it basically replaces standard 2440 and 2450, but we kind of really looked at the types of results that the CAE would be communicating, and we focused a little more on what those really are and how we could give sort of some context to those. So there's the final communication of engagement, conclusions, but also themes. Themes is a new term that was introduced. Some things that might be seen across multiple engagements, they might be seen throughout the organization. And that is where your insight comes in, whether we use the word or not. There's insight, and I think the word is used throughout the standards, even though it's not in the purpose statement. But the idea that you're looking for themes and also perhaps trends. Also, we talk about in that standard 11.3, conclusions at the level of the business unit or the organization. So we used to call that an overall opinion. We kind of toned down that, didn't really use that term, but we essentially replaced that with this idea of conclusions that may be not necessarily an opinion, but that could be a number of different ways that you deliver those conclusions at the level of the business or unit or the organization as a whole. So hopefully that's a more precise description. We had heard that there was some confusion about overall opinion, quite a bit actually. So those are some of the things that the Standards Board tried to address. 11.4 and 11.5 are the same title as the current standard, though we did tweak and adjust that definition of unacceptable level of risk a little bit, defined as the level of risk that exceeds the organization's risk tolerance. And the CAE has to discuss this with senior management before escalating it to the board. I believe that was similar to the current standard, but I just wanted to point out that those, it's still something that's discussed with senior management, but if unresolved, could be escalated to the board. So that pretty much covers, I'm trying to see if I've left anything out of this. I don't think so. I think I've covered. There is a public sector consideration in that, and of course, communication is different in the public sector. A lot of the communications are public. So there are some public sector considerations to look for in that, especially in the 11.5. And now I'll just move on to Principle 12, enhances quality. This is the Chief Audit Executive ensures conformance with the global internal audit standards and continuously improves the internal audit function's performance. And that is your quality assurance improvement program. The part here that was interesting and that maybe some people are struggling with is separating that into the governing domain and the managing domain. But we did want to emphasize the board's oversight of that. And now looking at the CAE responsibilities as well and the day-to-day carrying out of that program. So in standard 12.1, we look at the ongoing monitoring as part of the internal quality assessment, as well as the periodic self-assessments to evaluate conformance with the standards. Those two things were part of the existing internal quality assessment standard. One of the bigger focuses, though, in 12.2, you'll see is that performance measurement. So we really wanted to emphasize or highlight defining KPIs and also performance objectives so that the function can pursue continuous improvement. So the chief audit executive is responsible for ensuring that the function continuously improves. And this requires the development of measures and criteria to assess that performance and of engagements of auditors and of the function as a whole. So these measures are the basis of 12.2 and the focus of that. And let's see if there are other things in 12.2, I think that really covers it. And 12.3 talks about ensuring and improving engagement performance. And this is something that was kind of not necessarily emphasized, but was present in is present in the existing standards, which is supervising engagements. This standard focuses on that, making sure that engagements are performed in conformance with the standards and the internal audit methodologies, as well as making sure there are opportunities for internal auditors to receive guidance throughout the engagement, feedback, opportunities for improvement. All of those aspects of supervision are just brought a little more attention to in this standard 12.3. And with that, I am moving on to performing internal audit services, where I accidentally jumped to before, but this is domain 5, and this is the day-to-day performance of internal audit services. This domain mostly looks familiar. You've probably seen most of these standards in the existing, but there is just maybe a little more detail in certain parts, especially the field work that really wasn't necessarily present. It may have been in guidance, but wasn't necessarily in the standards. So hopefully we're giving a little more help to auditors to be able to carry out the day-to-day work. We have Principle 13, plans engagements effectively. Still all the planning steps that are really important. Internal auditors plan each engagement using a systematic, disciplined approach. Principle 14, conducting the engagement work. Internal auditors implement the engagement work program to achieve the engagement objectives. So Principle 13, all of those standards add up to your work program. And then in Principle 14, implementing that program to achieve the engagement objectives. And then Principle 15, communicating the engagement conclusions and then monitoring action plans. So after communicating the findings and conclusions, internal auditors monitor management's progress toward the completion of action plans. And that's the focus of Principle 15 and the standards in that principle. So I'll move into each one in a little more detail. Performing internal audit services. Again, I mentioned that most of these things kind of existed, but we did add a little more flesh to them. The emphasis on communication that I mentioned earlier shows up here in 13.1. It's not that it's the first thing you do, it's the thing you do throughout the entire engagement. And that's made very clear in this standard that calls for initial, ongoing, closing, and final communications and gives examples of those. There are definitely many other terms for these things: opening meetings, kickoff meetings, status updates, exit conferences. All of those concepts are fine. We're not prescribing a certain way to do it, but we are saying that it's important that this really occurs throughout the engagement, from the planning through the entire life cycle of the engagement to the CAE reporting level that was mentioned in the managing domain. Also, and again, the emphasis on risk is not missed, because 13.2 risk assessment was an assurance standard. We're raising that to a standard for every engagement, that there is some kind of risk assessment. It doesn't tell you the level of risk assessment you need to do, but that there is some risk assessment for every engagement. So that's 13.2. And 13.4 as well, evaluation criteria was only an assurance standard. It was a .A. Now it is raised to the level of there needs to be some criteria for your engagement. What are you going to measure against? What are you going to look at as part of your planning? And one of the little nuances as well is in 13.6 that engagement planning is a process. There isn't necessarily a bunch of separate documents. We really wanted to just simplify and streamline that all of the planning you do adds up to the work program as your documentation along the way, and you're planning your research, that it is the work program that we really want to end up with. So that's basically where 13.6 lands. We already had that term, but we had a lot of other terms that were confusing to some people, whether the engagement plan was a separate thing. So we tried to clarify that here. I think that I've covered everything in Principle 13. We'll move on to Principle 14. And this is where you will see definitely more than you've ever seen in the standards before about conducting engagement work. Principle 14 contains standards about the steps in conducting the work, including details on analyses and evaluations. Simply wasn't in the current standards. We had 2320, which is 1 or 2 lines about analysis and evaluation, but we now are breaking down the common activities in this process and more of a step-by-step approach. So 14.1 starts out with gathering your information for your analysis and evaluation. It talks about the quality of information you need to gather, and it needs to be relevant, reliable, sufficient. Needs to be able to produce evidence. Again, so those terms are described and hopefully a little more flesh and detail given to those. 14.2, the analyses to produce your potential findings. Findings is a term that we landed on. I know people have different feelings about that. I saw that in the Q&A. And so we note that a very broad interpretation of findings, but it is a commonly used term. And we're looking at comparing conditions to criteria to develop those findings. Also, in 14.3, we're looking now for how do I evaluate those findings, looking for a root cause, and is there a significant risk here? If there is, how significant? How is it rated or ranked or described? Some indication of significance. And then we ask in 14.4 for internal auditors to develop recommendations. There was a lot of debate about this on the standards board, whether to go directly to obtaining action plans. But we do think it's important that internal auditors have some idea about recommendations that they bring to management. And if management action plans are the eventual goal, that still doesn't stop us from having recommendations, although we may work with management to come up with action plans. So finally, developing a conclusion about the overall significance of those findings in aggregate, and that's 14.5 and of course 14.6 documentation, always important. So there's a kind of a wrap to that. What kind of documentation do we need to support the conclusions, making sure that that's sufficient and provides the necessary information. And then I just want to point out there are some public sector considerations described in here. We know that final communications and work papers may become public in the public sector, so there are some considerations for that. And wrapping everything up with Principle 15, communicating the engagement conclusions and monitoring action plans. Some of the things in these two simple little standards that we did here were clarified a separation between internal auditors' responsibility to create the communication and the CAE's responsibilities for distributing those. What goes into the final communication? What do internal auditors need to document? Objectives, scope, and conclusions. And finally, 15.2, internal auditors must confirm that management has implemented the agreed upon action plans. This is the follow-up step. And there, in some cases, like there is a public sector consideration here, there may need to be some kind of a public report produced on that implementation status, so that is mentioned as a consideration. I think I've finished 15. My voice is running out as well. So we come to a slide on the summary of the changes and just kind of looking back over everything. We are talking about consolidating and streamlining the elements of the mission definition, code of ethics, core principles, standards, and implementation guides into the standards, aligning the standards with the principles. Every standard aligns with some principle, adding the considerations for implementation and evidence of conformance for each standard. And then we mentioned and described all of the new content we have. And then also many of these are really just changes and clarifications. They sound like a lot. We described every one of them in great detail here today, but really they are just hoping to clarify and elevate the board's role in governing the function, the role of the CAE in managing the function, and then performance requirements to ensure the quality of internal audit services. That quality is more than just conformance with standards, but it also is all of these performance measures, and then adding the detailed steps to performing engagements that hopefully help, again, with delivering great quality service. And that is all for the summary of changes. I believe I'm coming back to Mike now.
Yes, Larissa, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, good. Well, first of all, before we move into the Q&A session, I just have to again say thank you to Paul and Larissa, who actually are not members of the Standards Board, but have been working, as I mentioned, with Art Anderson and David Petrisky to help us with our with the project management coordination, the technical writing, and not just four of them. I also do need to acknowledge there are dozens and dozens of folks that are on the staff that have been working as guidance experts and subject matter experts with us, and I want to thank all of them as well. But so today, as we do talk about as we've been talking about this, many questions have been coming in, and I will say that we're going to try and cover a few themes that we've seen. If you don't hear the question that you asked, I would remind you that we're going to put together it'll be like a frequently asked questions kind of document from this session and the one that we're going to do later today, and we will put that together. Now, but I will say that I have seen some of the questions that have come in that are fairly detailed in terms of that get actually into more conducting audits and more specificity than really we probably will cover here. Or even in the FAQ document. So there certainly is other guidance as has been represented that may help along with some of that. So I'm going to start off by taking one of the questions that has been one of the higher asked questions today, as well as at the presentations that I have been making on the proposed standards in various chapters and affiliates over the last couple of months. And I sometimes joke because it's, how does this all affect me? And so one of the questions that comes up a lot is, what about the external quality assessment or the quality assurance review that is going to be coming up? When should I have that? Should I delay it? How will that be structured? So I'll cover a few different points on our external quality assessments. As you saw when Paul went through that domain, the frequency remains at once every 5 years, and that is really what. First of all, I mean, you need to stick with that schedule, and really wherever the standards fall in to that, then you're going to apply that accordingly. If you look at the schedule of the rollout of the standards, if we are on target with our planned release of the final standards by the end of this calendar year, you will have a full year for implementation, which would be the end of 2024. And then any QAs that occur in that period of time would certainly be based on our current IPPF But then after you implement your next QA, which would probably be in 25 or 26, those would be looking at the standards that we're talking about now. So my advice would be just to continue whatever the schedule you normally have. And I would also say, and I think both Paul and Larissa reiterated, when we're making these changes in the standards, we did not change the profession of internal auditing. And when you look at the 15 principles, they were all very consistent with, they're certainly organized and structured in a way that we think is more efficient and improved, but they are still the same concepts and the same principles generally that I think we are all auditing with. And so some of the changes that would occur that a QA might look at would be some of the documentation, some of the things that are now mentioned in the considerations for our evidence of conformance. And so I think that that's where you'll look at, in fact, one of the very last slides that I'll cover in a moment says that, you could look at that, do an assessment where you are now to where, if there are changes or, gaps that you may want to close, and those would be the kinds of things that we would consider. The other thing that I'll just mention about the EQA external quality assessment process is that is something that is actually not under the purview of the Standards Board. The Standards Board promulgates the standards, and then there are other processes that at the IIA that and other groups that facilitate that. So even though the Standards Board isn't directly responsible for overseeing that, we certainly are engaged in the things that we did when we looked at the current at the draft that we proposed is we tried to structure that such that the external quality assessment could use them. And in fact, we hope make some changes to that as well. I think, and this is just my opinion, not that Standards Board, but I think that there are some ways in which that process could be enhanced to be more effective. We heard that from our some of the principal partners and others who do the QA. So I think I would look for some changes that might be in place. But again, those would be several years down the road. So that is one topic there. And so I am going to see, while I've been talking, if our team has been developing what our next question is that we're going to cover. So let me look into that. And if either Paul or Larissa are ready there, while I pull this up, I'll let you go ahead.
Well, there's one that again, I've saw a few questions about this, and this is kind of a summary of those questions where people were wondering whether the standards are becoming more rules-based than principle-based because the number of musts have gone up so much. And I'd like to point out that what we're trying to do is that they're still principle-based, and there are a variety of ways that a must requirement can be met. But what the standards are really trying to do is to help make sure that every internal auditor around the world, every internal audit function around the world understands what it takes to really embrace and comply and achieve those principles. Ultimately, it's the principles that will really matter. And we'll see, maybe the quality assurance review will move to one that's focused on the principles more so than the standards. Time will tell. But the other thing I will say is that the number of musts, if you do a word count, has gone up notably. And the reason for that is in the prior standards, there was pretty much one must per standard, where now what we've done, for those who've already gotten into it, is for a standard, we may have several must statements to try and clarify exactly what needs to be done in order to achieve that standard and then ultimately the principle. So I wouldn't look at that as being rules-based per se. I would look at that as just being more declarative, provide more clarity around how to achieve that principle. And certainly open if either Larissa or Mike have any further comments on that.
Thank you, Paul. I think that covered it. I will take one that has come in, or several that have come in related to the standards and their ability to stay up with current things that come out or new emerging topics that come out. And so let me comment first a little bit about the philosophy or the concept of the standards themselves. You know, I mentioned at the outset of this call that it's been about 20 years since the standards had a significant change. And really, the standards themselves are intended to, let's say, use the phrase, stand the test of time, hopefully. You know, we don't want to have to go through a process like this with all of the due process that is included when a new topical issue comes up that may be extremely relevant for us as internal auditors to consider and audit or advise on, but perhaps doesn't need to be in the standards. So if you'll recall the slide that we had earlier when we talked about topical requirements, that's one of the reasons that the proposed change to the framework, the IPPF, and that's another question that's kind of come up a bit on some of the social media things that I've observed, is that the framework doesn't go away. It does fade a little into the background because the framework will now include the global internal audit standards that we're talking about, as well as the concept of the topical requirements that Larissa mentioned. And those topical requirements are things that we think that this would fall into if you know our world is seeing something like ESG, for example, that comes up. That's not something that we necessarily think we should rush to the global internal audit standards to incorporate ESG auditing concepts in there. But in the topical requirement, we think that's a great place for that to cover the governance, risk management, control issues or questions or audit activities that would be around ESG topics. And we can be more agile and quicker to our membership and stakeholders with those kinds of guidance in that setting. So hopefully that answers a couple of different questions, both about current issues that come up as well as the structure of the framework, which will now have global internal audit standards, topical requirements, and then other guidance. So Paul or Larissa, while I was talking, did we have another one queued up?
Well, I haven't seen a lot of questions on this, but you know, Mike, and you're probably in the best position to do this. It might be worthwhile to talk a little bit about the stakeholder engagement that has occurred as a part of this process, both what's already happened and then what is happening as a part of the public exposure process as well. I think it's important that people understand that this is not just listening to other internal auditors.
Thank you, Paul, for that. Yes, you know, as I mentioned that it's really been a couple of years that we've been working on gathering this, and the Oversight Council has probably challenged us on this probably as much as anything, that we do go outside and really solicit and try and gather input. And so we did that in a variety of ways. You know, in terms of our stakeholder groups, we did identify, I think, if my memory serves correctly, over 85 different groups that we specifically know are in the space or somehow connected with audit-related activities, whether it be from a regulatory perspective, a service provider perspective, a board representation perspective. We asked affiliates around the world to tell us who are the stakeholders that you have. Certainly, we have many stakeholders internal to our organizations, but here we are talking about the external stakeholders. We invited them to directly participate. We, Lily B., who I mentioned, and myself and others went either in person or a lot of virtual meetings and spoke to those groups about our project, solicited their input. We gathered them for a couple of very significant events last fall. One was in the U.S. in Washington, D.C. One was in Europe, in Brussels. And we got them around the table and shared with them our drafts and asked for their feedback and took it. And I mean, it documented and took it and helped us in the drafting. And we've reached out now that we're in the public comment period to those same folks, because we've been bringing them along now for over a year. And so we are going to really look forward to their informed responses and comments during the survey, or as they share that information with us. So please be assured that we are trying to reach out and get as much input as possible, and then be responsible in how we document that and see how it affects changes to the next version.
I've got one thing I would like to comment on before we miss it, and that is some folks are asking, where can I find highlights to present to the board of directors? Where can I find a crosswalk document between the old and the new? So I just wanted to quickly, if I could show this particular slide with the little screenshots of our web pages. So the IPPF Evolution webpage, the IIA.org/IPPF Evolution. You'll find all of the history, including the stakeholder engagement, lots of FAQs up and down that page, as well as videos explaining things and documents you can download. So please check that out. And then on the right here, you say, if you want to go directly to download the draft and take the survey, and you just want a few little resources to help you understand the draft and the survey, those are here on this Global Internal Audit Standards public comment page. There's a click through from both pages to each other. So I just wanted to point out to you that those are there. There is a document that we've just created to help sum up Domain 3 in a double-sided one sheet that you can present. So please find that document. We also have a lot of things in the resources section of this presentation that you can just download directly just to get you there faster.
Larissa, please take the next slide and then to cover that last point, and then I'll come back.
Just to kind of point out that when you do go to that Global Internal Audit Standards public comment page, you select your language. We do have all the languages there. You can check out the resources there for more help, and just click through to begin the survey. The survey is all online. The standards can be downloaded as a PDF, so you can have those. And there's even a preview document that you can look through to kind of guide you before you start filling out the survey if you haven't already. But again, the English version does close May 30th, so we do want to get you reading that. That should help. And I just wanted to point out that you do not have to answer a question about every single standard. You are required to answer at least one question about each domain. And from there, you can select specific standards that you want to comment on. Comments are optional for no matter what you answer, whether you agree, you disagree, strongly, or neutral. You can comment if you'd like, but you are not required to comment. So just wanted to say, if you're managing your time, that you definitely can choose what you want to answer. You can choose to answer none about the standards and just answer at the level of the domain. But we really want your input.
Thank you. Thank you, Larissa. And so as we close in these final 2 minutes, here are the things, and we've even referenced them. Read the draft and complete the survey. Yes, it is a significant commitment, but it's one that we hope you will step up to be responsible, as you are already indicating by your participation today. Again, this does not happen that often. So we greatly appreciate the effort and the time commitment you will make. Inform the stakeholders. Use this as an opportunity to have conversations with your management and board about our profession. Take advantage of this as a time to elevate what you're doing with them. And then I mentioned a moment ago, looking at where you're at, the assessment, any gaps, and develop a plan so that you can put it together. You've seen the latest information, the resources that Larissa pointed you to. So with that, I do want to thank you again. We are part of elevating the standards. We think that when we do that, our impact, our contributions to the profession are going to go up, and we are going to be seen as the valued resource and participants and supporters of our organizations to help them be successful, as we've mentioned in the purpose. So thank you very much for your time today. With that, I wish you the best. Have a good day.